Okay.
So guys, I'll start introducing with myself. My name is Edric Lin. I'm currently an English teacher in Taipei, Taiwan. I teach mainly elementary English. And maybe we're gonna go around and everyone can introduce their name, where they're currently working, and yeah. So let's start with Aaron, maybe.
Hey everyone, my name is Aaron Lam. I'm a tech teacher here in Hong Kong. I teach at a school called the Harbor School. It's a special needs school, and yeah, I'm very excited to talk about mobile stuff and podcasts. So next we have Momita.
Hi everyone, I'm Momita. I'm an instructional designer, and my work entails creating technical and financial courses using a variety of media. I have worked across many industries and organizations, and unfortunately, I have not used podcasts in my profession so far. So I'm very excited to learn about podcasts in this project, and maybe I'll find a way how to utilize it in my upcoming career and profession. Thank you. Yeah. So I think next is Alexis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis Hanford. I currently live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I work as a program assistant at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. I've been there about 2 years now, and I work in the continuing education department. So majority of the students that I help and contract instructors that I work with it's non-credit. So a lot of them are coming from industry, and they're looking to expand on their skill set, or maybe they're even looking to completely change their career, but they don't want to go back for a diploma or a degree. They'll come to us just for kind of quick skill building. So that's what I've been doing the last couple of years, and I'm hoping that in the future I'll be able to take on a bigger role in instructional design or usability and help develop courses more than just help set them up, which is what I do right now. And next we have Joyce.
Hi, I'm Joyce, and I live and work on the traditional territories of the Semiahmoo First Nation in South Surrey, British Columbia. I am an English department curriculum leader and teacher at a K-12 co-ed independent school in South Surrey. I've been teaching English language and literature for over 18 years now. Big fan of constructivist learning strategies and e-learning. I hope to use podcasts in my own teaching to see how group podcasts such as this one might contribute to collaborative learning. And finally, Paul.
Hi everybody, I'm Paul Pringale, and I am currently a substitute teacher in the Vancouver School Board. And I've been in that position for about 4 years. My job is exciting because I get to see the wide, very broad view of the city and the district, of the problems and the really, really great things that various professional educators are doing in their school communities. I started my career working in China for 3 years at a BC offshore school teaching IT, multimedia, business education, and socials. And when I came back to Canada, within that 4 years of substitute teaching, I've taught 2 years of elementary school in grade 4 and 5 and 6. And to be honest, I don't have much experience with podcasts at all, as I prefer listening to music during my commute and making music using my guitars. So, like Joyce, I'm into constructivism, particularly social cultural constructivism, in teaching and learning.
All right, thank you, Paul. So right now I'm just gonna throw out a quick question. So remember that when you are answering, please tell us your name first, so we know so that the listener can remember who you are. And also, so the first question I want to throw out is, what is your personal experience with podcasting? So maybe you could start by telling us, how did you start listening to podcasts? Or if you never listened to a podcast, what kind of podcast would you like to listen to? So I'll throw this question first at Alexis.
Sure. Thanks, Edric. Well, everyone knows already Alexis talking here, but I think my first kind of introduction to podcasts was when I was actually an undergrad student. I used to listen to them as a way to kind of gain more information about certain things. So oftentimes I'd have really complicated books to read, or just something that didn't make sense. I don't know if anyone here has read The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but I had to read that book in my undergrad, and it's pretty dense, and I happened to find a podcast on it which really broke it down for me within about an hour, and it provided more information to me than I ever could have gathered on my own. So that was kind of my first introduction into podcasts, and then in more recent years, I have used them more for personal use. I tend to kind of look for ones that are almost a little bit scandalous in content. I find that podcasts are kind of a good medium for information that maybe people don't want to put their face to, but that they still want to share with the world and get feedback on. So one of the podcasts I listen to right now is Stuff Your Mom Never Told You, which kind of talks about feminist issues and various kind of controversial world issues of today. So that's kind of my personal experience with podcasts. And then in my workplace right now, we're actually doing some research into how we can better use podcasts in the classroom and maybe even through distance learning, whether that's offering an entire course in podcast format or just using podcasts as a supplementary tool for teachers, maybe as almost like a homework assignment or for additional information for their students. We're kind of exploring that right now. So being able to explore with my team of fellow podcast members, the podcast team members, will help me better explore this topic, and hopefully we'll all learn something to bring into our careers. And I'll pass it off to Joyce.
We seem to have a little connection issue, maybe. So maybe I'm going to throw the mic right now. Oh, never mind. There we go.
Hi, sorry. This is Joyce here, and I just want to say that from the beginning, I've said that I personally am not an avid podcast listener. However, I do have a partner who is an eternal and varied hobbyist and has so many interests that are really, really and probably addictions, to be frank, that are supported through his podcast listening and his podcast habits. So I kind of by proxy know about them and understand them, and he also has produced some. So that's how I sort of they got onto my radar. And then when I realized what they were and how they could be used, I thought, what a great opportunity for some of my students. So usually for sort of summative final projects, I'll give a kind of a choice to the students. So those who want to write a traditional analytical essay can do so. Those who want to produce video can do so, as long as all of the learning outcomes that we've discussed are being met. And I thought, I'm going to throw podcasts in there to see how that goes. So they, some of the students work together in groups to create a literature review podcast. So basically recorded book clubs. And what was interesting is that they were all using different sources and different novels to kind of discuss the same critical questions. So they really have to kind of support from their own novel and speak as the expert on their novel while answering one single question or discussion topic that applied to all of them. So if I do listen to podcasts, it's because I have a longer period of time to dedicate to them. I have listened in the past usually to funny ones. I really enjoy the Professor Blastoff podcast, which is with a comedian named Tig Notaro. And then I also really enjoy listening to the McElroy brothers on My Brother, and Me. And so those are just really silly, light kind of looking at the world with humor podcasts. And those are what I've really enjoyed in the past.
All right, thank you, Joyce. Sorry, because of time constraints and we have a couple of questions we'd like to cover. I would like to hand the mic to Aaron, because Aaron, previously you described to us that you have a very particular experience with a student regarding podcasts. If you feel comfortable, would you like to explain the story to our listeners, please, Aaron?
Yeah, so hi, Aaron here again. And just a reminder, so I work as a tech teacher at a special needs school. Personally, I've always enjoyed podcasts since I think as long as I could remember. And what really drew me to them was, I think, oral storytelling, which I feel like is kind of a lost art. I think when we hear someone's voice talking, I think we're just naturally drawn to it. And the point of the podcast really makes you hone in on the words and the way people talk. And my story has to do with that. So there was there's a girl, she was about 8, and I've known her and I taught her for about 4 or 5 years. And I'll call this girl Irene. It's not her real name. But Irene was selectively mute. And she had a very rough background. She was born out of a very strange situation in the Philippines where she didn't have a father. She had a mom. They traveled to Hong Kong. There was a new father in the picture, but things at home were strange. So I think stress at home and all these big changes made her really anxious to talk. So for about 4 or 5 years, I taught the student, never hearing her voice. Nobody at school had heard Irene's voice ever. And I couldn't find out any way how I could connect with her and really hear her voice. And one day I tried to do a podcast assignment where I had the kids talk about something they were really into for about a minute or so, just make a very, very short, personal kind of almost like a personal audio journal, and then they would share it with the class. And I really didn't think Irene would be interested. But it turns out she went home that night and she recorded the best podcast. And I'll try to maybe attach a little snippet at the end here so we can hear her voice. But it was the first time any of her teachers, any of her friends, anyone had actually heard her voice when she finally completed that assignment. And it was just one of the most emotional moments I had as a teacher, one of the biggest breakthroughs. And that was really thanks to podcasting. It really opened up her voice in a way that I think, no one else could figure out how. So that was my personal experience with podcasting. And I think there's great power in the human voice. So I'll pass it back to you, Eddie. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. That was a really great story. When the first time we heard that story, we were like, oh my gosh, we have to tell this story because this is like exactly what podcasts can do. So right now I'm going to direct 2 more stories, a very general story at Momita and Paul. Feel free to chime in when you guys feel like it. When we're doing a little podcasting, we think back and we have something out there that's very, very similar. It's called vodcasting, which is kind of like using a video for a podcast. So as a curious question, suppose you have a choice to do a podcast versus a vodcast. Which one would you prefer and why? I just want to compare between popular podcast and vodcast. Yeah, for Momita.
I'll go here. This is Momita. So like I said initially, I don't have a lot of experience hearing podcasts and different things. However, while researching, I found that podcasts can be more than audio. Like it can also be video, and different medias can coexist. And then I found that if video comes into the picture, then I have been using podcasts, like you said, for a long time because I subscribe to TED videos and I subscribe to many inspirational videos or funny videos, and they have regular series coming up, like web series kind of things. Some fictional, some stand-up comic series and stuff like that. So I have been subscribing to those for a long time, but not the traditional podcast. But yeah, so given a choice, I don't know. Personally, I connect more when where there is a face attached to it. Like, even for a song, if I would, if that's just me, I guess I would rather listen it on YouTube and even see the lyrics on the screen, even when there is no proper video. So get, I find myself attached to that kind of medium more. So yeah, so for me, with podcasts would be an ideal option as compared to podcasts.
All right, thank you, Mamita.
I think that interesting you brought up visuals actually, because I think in my personal experiences with podcasts, I'm sort of like Mamita on a personal level. I used to listen to one podcast on and off when I was abroad, and this is Paul speaking. The TYT network, which is the Young Turks news commentary, which I would describe as like as liberal progressive with a smidgen of anti-establishment commentary, but also a bit of personal and sports broadcasting flair. And the personal with sports flair of the podcast is like really important in what I've seen so far, and what I've understood in for broadcasting, or like radio broadcasting. So yeah, that's really important in my opinion. I guess perhaps I'll talk about that in the next episode. But the fact that I was able to actually get the Young Turks podcast during my time in China was really neat. I'd say most of the time I podcasted the Young Turks, but sometimes I'd actually just look it up on YouTube and watch sections of episodes or look them up after something significant hit the news. For example, just the other day, like Hugh Hefner died, and I wanted the Young Turks weigh in on that, so I just looked it up on YouTube rather than sort of listening to a longer audio format. I would also err on the side of vodcasts as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned YouTube. I just want to maybe go a bit deeper on that. Today I think there is almost no kids or no adult who has not heard of YouTube. Yet, is YouTube a form of? Do you think YouTube is a form of vodcasting, as in like the extension of podcasting? Because it is a storytelling, possibly with videos and images. So I'll open the question to anybody who wants to answer.
So this is Joyce here, and I think that in my exploration with podcasts, the thing for me is the serialization of it. So if it is a continued effort by a couple of people or a single author, sort of, so to speak, that's what is my definition of what a podcast is. So YouTube videos that are, sort of put out by one person over and over again. I think it definitely does blur the line between vodcast, right, and just a YouTube video. I'm thinking about, like, my children are addicted to this one YouTube Minecraft game player who has like over, I don't even know, like millions of subscribers, right? It's just an insane idea to me. And yet, when we went and he actually recently went on tour, and we went to see him and told the U.S. Customs border at Washington, and they're like, "Who are you going to see?" So it's interesting that millions of people can know about this person, and yet like they're not really celebrities in the way others are. So sorry, I digressed a bit, but I think there's definitely a blurring of the lines between podcasts and YouTube videos.
Definitely.
But to answer your earlier question about which one I prefer, I would have to say podcasts, because podcasts require me to keep my eyes in one place. Right, so I prefer podcasts because I can just kind of plug in and walk around and still do other things, errands, go shopping, ride the train, be on the train, and still be kind of aware of my visual surroundings, but kind of mentally and orally be somewhere else.
Thank you, Joyce. You mentioned a very good point about podcasting, is that it only occupies one of your senses, which is your hearing. So as an extension to that question, I would like to ask maybe people who live in different backgrounds, like Aaron, who lives in Hong Kong, who has a very urban background, versus maybe Joyce or other people who has lived in more suburban or suburb background. Is the background of where you live or your lifestyle causing you to, or makes you like podcasts more or less, or make you use podcasts more often or not? So I'd like to open the floor to anybody who would like to contribute. So just unmute your mic and start talking.
Hey, sorry. So hey, I'll grab it. So I'm Aaron, and I live in Hong Kong. And one of my most important times, I think, in my day is going to work and coming home from work, because in a really busy city like Hong Kong, 7.4 million people, it's really, really hard to find slices of personal time and personal space. And I find when I ride the train to work, my commute's about 45 minutes. I need something to tune out the rest of society, because if I don't have that barrier, I find I can't get to work. I'm not prepared. I'm not in the right mindset. So I personally prefer podcasts, audio, so I can still navigate, walk around, take the train, do what I need to do without having my eyes glued to the screen. And that's sort of my way of finding sanctuary. And I think in an urban setting especially, it's really vital, and it's really vital that you keep your eyes up. I mean, how many times have we been in a big city and heard news of people like falling down manholes or something because they're on the phone? I don't know, it's obviously an exaggeration, but these things sort of happen. And I think, yeah, in an urban setting, audio definitely, in my opinion, trumps video. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you, Aaron. So would anybody like to pick up on that or respond to that? Yeah, Momita?
This is Momita. So you just asked about the culture and the background of how it affects whether we listen or subscribe. So I just want to touch upon the history of podcast here a little bit, that it was initially only designed for Apple iPod devices, and later it migrated to other devices. So I recently migrated to Canada, but before that I was in India when podcast was born, and at that time I didn't have access to Apple devices.
Sorry,
as
Mamita.
such. So
Mamita, I can interrupt you. Maybe
yes?
Can you speak closer to your microphone so the listener can pick up the voice a little bit better? Thank you.
Yeah,
Continue,
sure.
please. That's
Sure.
great. Thank
Can you hear
you.
me now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What I was saying is that I'm just going to touch upon the history of podcasts a little bit here, because I migrated to Canada 2 years ago, and before that I was always in India. And when podcast was born, it was solely for an Apple device, and later it migrated to, as its popularity grew in this part of the world, it migrated to other devices and other forms, and it got broadened, and it became a phenomenon. So, in the earlier years, I didn't have access to Apple devices or broadband internet, for example. So that was one of the reasons that I got introduced to podcast or similar technology much later down the pipeline. And even when I got introduced to it, I got introduced to audio or video clips on the internet, which I could subscribe to using my Wi-Fi or broadband, but not my mobile devices, because those kind of things are technologically not always feasible in that part of the world. So that is obviously one of the reasons why my familiarity with podcast is different as compared to many others.
Thank you, Momita. And do anyone else want to add something to it? If not, I have another question.
Yeah.
All right, Alexis?
Yeah, I'll just jump in quick. I don't have too much to say on this. This is Alexis, but I was just going to say that in a way, I enjoy podcasts, but I also find that I gravitate towards kind of the video podcasts, almost the vlogging a little bit more in certain ways. And I'm not sure why. It could be something to do with the fact that I live in Calgary, and although Calgary is 1.2 million people, which is nowhere near the size of somewhere like Hong Kong or even in India. Lots of people in India. But Calgary, I mean, I just looked it up just so I can have a number for you, but it's 825 square kilometers. So really people are very spread out. And that might factor into the reason why I gravitate more towards videos. Like I'd say like in a whole day, I really don't run into that many people in comparison to some. So I find that there's certain people that I follow on even YouTube that are almost like my internet friends.
Okay.
It sounds almost a little bit weird and secluded, but in a way, I think that a lot of people can relate to this, that you have these specific YouTubers that you connect to, and because you can see their face, you kind of get a deeper connection. But at the same time, I feel that people that produce YouTube videos almost have to have a certain level of charisma that people with podcasts maybe don't need to have. It's like podcasts are almost for the introverts of the world to kind of like get out there and be extroverted in a certain medium. So I think podcasts kind of give a voice to people that otherwise would never do videos. So while I like YouTube, I can see the benefit of having podcasts where it's just audio. I think you kind of get a different kind of producer behind the scene with both types of mediums.
Thank you, Alexis. So if it's okay, I would like to move on to probably one last question before we end it for today. So my one last question for you guys thinking about is, what is possibly some weaknesses regarding, podcasts? As Alexis has mentioned, she kind of gravitates toward podcasts because you can associate the voice with a face. So as fellow teacher, I want maybe ask you guys, why don't we have more podcasts in the classroom? Is there certain limitations or weaknesses of podcasts that makes it difficult to implement in the classroom? So anyone can jump in.
I think that podcasts sort of as a form as a technology as a medium, like audio as a medium in general, sort of like radio, for example, it encouraged interpersonal communications. That's great for I think that there's a lot of interpersonal communications within the classroom already. So maybe perhaps one sort of thing that prevents people from using this technology as in classroom would be that because there's so much interpersonal communication already. Maybe what's the point of making another thing that's so interpersonal and so audio when you could get that just by talking to your teacher or talking to other classmates.
Oh, so you're kind of saying that? Yeah, I think I get your point. I think I get your point. You're trying to say that podcast is like, it's almost like a friend which you cannot see, or you can only hear exclusively. So why would you have a friend like that? You can have, I guess, friends you can also see, talk to, and interact with other ways. Are you kind of pointing in that direction? Am I paraphrasing it okay?
I think so, yeah, and especially the physicality of the classroom, you get to see them face to face. So I mean,
the physicality, right? That's a very good point.
Yeah,
I mean, like bring back. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Joyce here, and I have to agree with Paul in that I teach high school students, and I have actually played clips of podcasts in class before, and it's awkward because they don't know where to look. So these are teenagers we're talking about, right? And so I can see them taking it home and listening to it in sort of a flipped learning environment. They would probably do that. But I'm just looking at this 2009 article here, and it's sort of a literature review of podcast use in K-12 and higher education. And, the barriers that they list are unfamiliarity with podcasts, which I would agree with. When I first introduced the idea in my own classes, probably only one or two were really familiar with the idea of podcasts. And these are young kids who are really wired in all the time, right? They know what's going on with tech. And then the other issue is technical problems in accessing, downloading podcasts. And then finally is not seeing the relevance for their learning, right? Which is, for teenagers, again, that's kind of the issue with using anything in the classroom, is like you have to make them see the relevance first, and then they'll buy into it.
All right, thank you, Joy. Those are very good points.
Yeah, sorry, this is Alexis. That makes me think that because we're sort of a society of mobile devices now with our smartphones and everything, we're so used to looking at a screen. We don't know where to look if we're not looking at our screen. Just like, people joke around. People don't know what to do with their hands unless they're texting on their phone. It's kind of like we've forgotten how to interact in a physical space without these kind of devices in our hand. And because smartphones and iPads and all these sorts of tablet handheld devices have a screen where you can look, I wonder if that's almost where we're running into an issue with audio only, where past generations with radio, it was no problem. It was their everyday life that they only listened to audio, right? So kind of interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and echo Alexis's point and Joyce's point and also Paul's point. I mean, I think what I'm hearing is a big frustration is like maybe we're just not meeting them in their language or on their level. And I also teach high schoolers and middle schoolers, and I've tried to make kids record podcasts. And the big question, always is, why are we doing this again? Like, why aren't we doing a video? Why do we have to be so antiquated? And I can't help but feel like I may be one of those teachers at the front of a math class saying, okay, everybody put your calculators away. You're never going to have calculators with you in real life. And then, it turns out that's not true. And I can't help but feel maybe that it's a generational thing. Now I feel like an old person, but like... maybe someone else can kind of respond to that. Just something to think about. Maybe video is just not for them. I mean, they were born and YouTube was already there. And like Mamita said, we grew up with podcasts and it was very exciting. And to them, it's just old news. So would someone respond to that? What do you guys think?
I think I'll also answer a bit to that, is that, there's recently been an article in Nature's Neuroscience saying that our attention span is actually getting shorter compared to maybe 20, 30 years ago. Our attention span right now is about 8 to 12 seconds, which is about equivalent of a goldfish. So I think maybe that it kind of points out a point that maybe, we need the video to act as a stimulator to constantly pull us back into the message of the podcast. Whereas a podcast, we're kind of listening. Eventually, without a stimulant, you maybe just simply fall asleep because you're not constantly getting stimulated. I think maybe this is also a possible reason for the I wouldn't say unpopularity, but the unfamiliarity with podcasts with today's generation. So, that's about time's up for today's podcast, and I would like to thank all the people here for answering the questions. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Mumita. And thank you, Paul. This is Edric, your host, signing off. Thank you.